Chapter 1. The Whisper Beneath the Wisteria Marleycombe. Early spring, the village of Marleycombe, with its thatched cottages and time-worn stone paths, had just begun to exhale winter's breath when something dark took root beneath the daffodils. A brisk April morning, the sun peeked over the hedgerows with an apologetic glow. Birds chirped nervously in budding trees, and the scent of damp earth hung in the air. It was the sort of morning that whispered promises of renewal, though, as fate would have it, something far less gentle was stirring Dot at the edge of Marleycombe. Stood Fernley House, a grand estate once admired for its gardens, now largely kept alive by duty and habit. Its once glorious parterre, overgrown and wild in places, still boasted rows of wisteria that curled like lazy smoke over wrought iron. Arches. It was there, in the so-called Garden of Echoes, a nickname given by the local children for its odd, echo-like acoustics among the trellises that the scream was first heard Dot at precisely 7:43 a.m. Ivy Jessup, longtime housekeeper to the recently deceased Lady Margaret Ediving, dropped her metal watering can upon hearing the cry. It clanged against the flagstones and rolled, spraying muddy water over her apron. The scream was sharp, not of fear, but grief, soul-splitting, as though someone had just met something they could not unsee. Moments later, a flurry of motion stirred the house. "What on earth?" muttered Roger Edivane, Margaret's estranged nephew and reluctant inheritor of Fernley, hurrying out the back door in his slippers. He followed the sound, and there, beneath the draping curtain of lavender blossoms, stood Gilly Hart, the young village historian and garden archivist. Her hands were to her mouth, eyes wide, as if the color had been scraped off her face. Roger followed her trembling gaze and stopped. There, half buried in the gravel near the sundial, lay a figure, dressed in tweed, legs awkwardly twisted, and the back of the head a mess of blood and dirt. A garden trowel, bent at the middle, lay just inches from the body. It was Leonard Pike, the village solicitor. Dead. At the edge of Marleycombe. On Church Lane, Miss Jane Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. The cream had curdled slightly. She made a small sound of disapproval and pushed the cup away. She had noticed it. Noticed that something in the air had felt off this morning. Not in the dramatic way of novels or silly radio dramas, but in that very particular hush that sometimes falls before something awful happens. The birds had fallen silent for a moment, longer than usual. The post had arrived 10 minutes late. And Tabby, the milkman's cat, had hissed at nothing when passing the yew hedge. Small things. But Miss Marple knew that life was a collection of small things. And when they shifted out of place, it meant something was about to unravel. By 9 o'clock, the news had already made its first lap around the village green. The vicar's wife told Mrs. Carroway, who told her butcher, who told his cousin in Helmsworth over the phone. By the time Miss Marple reached the grocer's for a tin of golden syrup, whispers were darting between cabbages and tea tins like midges in summer. Dead, poor man, in the garden at Fernley, of all places. Heard it was a trowel to the head. Imagine Leonard Pike, not the friendliest chap, but really murdered. Maybe it was one of those London types. Gilly said she saw some stranger around earlier in the week. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She simply nodded once, asked for her change, and tucked her purse into her basket. But her eyes, those pale, knowing eyes, flicked slightly as she turned away. Leonard Pike, dead. He had once tried to charge her 3 guineas for altering her. Well, when all she'd asked was to add her cat as a beneficiary to her old silver tea service. Not particularly well liked, she thought, but even the least liked people usually died in their beds. This was something else. In the afternoon, the constable cordoned off Fernley's garden with yellow ribbon and a clipboard. Sergeant Harry Little, a man built like a wardrobe with a mustache to match, took statements from Roger and Gilly under the dripping lilacs. "Last time you saw Mr. Pike alive?" he asked Gilly. "Yesterday, around 4. He was going through Lady Margaret's papers. Something about property lines and a missing codicil. Said he had to check on the old boundary records. And you?" He turned to Roger. Roger scratched the back of his neck. "Haven't seen him since last week. We argued. He wanted to sell off part of the estate. I told him to stuff it." Little raised an eyebrow. "You didn't happen to, do any gardening this morning?" "No," Roger said, tight-lipped. "I was inside, making toast." Miss Marple, sitting unnoticed on a stone bench nearby with her knitting, let her fingers slow slightly. A man dead in a garden. A tool used as a weapon. Papers about boundary lines. And a strained nephew inheritance situation. She reached down and brushed a small bit of soil from her shoe. It didn't escape her notice that it smelled. Not quite like compost. More like fresh earth, recently disturbed. She looked toward the sundial. The Garden of Echoes was living up to its name. Something had been buried. And now something else had been uncovered. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The pattern was complicated, but she liked that. She always had a gift for untangling threads. Chapter 2. Rumors in Bloom Early Come. Afternoon shadows. By the time the church bell tolled 3, the entire village was awash in speculation. Marleycombe had always been a place where life moved, at the pace of a winding river. Nothing ever truly happened, and when it did, it happened slowly. People noticed everything. Who left which church pew early, whose curtains were drawn at odd hours, who bought 2 bottles of brandy instead of 1. But murder? That wasn't something Marleycombe noticed. It was something that shocked it to. The the village tea-house, the rose petal, became the unofficial epicenter of gossip. Inside, cups clinked and whispers rustled more loudly than napkins. Conversations broke off and picked up again, depending on who walked through the door. "She found him, did she?" said Mr. Elcott, the retired schoolmaster, adjusting his spectacles. "Gilly?" "Hart," replied Mrs. Penelope Farrow, with a breathless nod. "Says she was cataloging old garden plans for the parish archive. Imagine stumbling across a body like that face down in gravel." "Face up, actually," said a woman near the window. "Rosa Dobbs told me he was on his back, mouth open, like he'd been trying to say something." Miss Marple sat 3 tables away, buttering a scone. She did not look up, but she listened closely. Rosa Dobbs was not known for her accuracy. She once declared a chimney sweep had eloped with the baker's daughter, only to be contradicted when the poor man returned 3 days later with nothing but soot and a flue. Still, Rosa had a gift for sniffing out the bones of a story. It wasn't always true, but it was rarely pulled from thin air. Miss Marple reached for her notebook, a tiny thing covered in floral cloth, and jotted down 3 simple words. Position. Tools. Witness. At the police station. Sergeant Little sat at his desk, chewing thoughtfully on the end of a pencil. The coroner's preliminary report lay in front of him. Blunt force trauma. Time of death between 6:30 and 7:15 a.m. The wound was delivered with enough strength to shatter part of the skull, unusual for a weapon like a garden trowel. He scratched his chin. Must have been someone strong or angry, or both. "Pike wasn't exactly warm-hearted," said Constable Webb, placing 2 cups of lukewarm tea on the desk. "You know he charged old Mrs. Tembley a full fee for canceling her." "Well, after she got her memory back?" Little grunted. "That'll make you popular." There was a knock. Gilly Hart stood in the doorway, pale but composed. Her hands were clasped in front of her trench coat like a schoolgirl. "Sorry to disturb?" she said quietly. I remembered. Something odd about the sundial." Little motioned her in. "I went back just after the police left the scene," she continued. I shouldn't have, but I was trying to find my field journal. I noticed that the sundial, it's been moved. Little raised an eyebrow. Moved. Shifted a little. A few degrees. I've spent hours measuring angles there for the archival work. It doesn't face due south anymore. It's pointing slightly west. Could someone have knocked into it? No. It's bolted to the foundation. Someone would have to unscrew it. Little sat up straighter. Why would someone do that? Gilly hesitated. To mark something, or to hide something. She left soon after, and Little stared out the window, brow furrowed. He didn't notice Miss Marple pass by just outside, walking at a leisurely pace with a bag of seed potatoes and a pocket, full of silent observations. That evening, a mist drifted down from the hills, curling into corners and doorways like a secret. Fernley House, once a symbol of old money and older tradition, loomed even more heavily under the fog dot inside. Roger Edivane poured himself a generous glass of whiskey. His eyes flicked toward the empty chair near the fireplace, the chair that had always belonged to his Aunt Margaret before her passing 2 months prior. First her, he muttered. Now this bloody mess. He downed the drink and slammed the glass down harder than intended. He hated the house, the obligation, the endless creaking, and now a solicitor dead in the garden. On his property? He turned toward the grandfather clock, but the ticking made him anxious. He pulled the heavy curtain across the window and muttered a sharp curse when he noticed muddy footprints just outside on the flagstone path. Not his. Not the gardener's. Someone had been near the house. Recently, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk by candlelight. She had long ago dispensed with bright electric bulbs in favor of a softer, thinking kind of glow. On the desk was a photograph of Lady Margaret Edivane, taken during the Marleycombe Centennial picnic a few years prior. Stiff, proud, gloved. A woman of quiet determination and deeper shadows. Miss Marple remembered Margaret well, and she remembered Leonard Pike. She also remembered something else. Lady. Margaret had once told her, quite casually over tea, that she had changed her will. Not for Roger's sake, she'd said with a grim twist of her mouth, but because he'd expect it. I think he ought to be surprised. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a line. If Margaret had changed her will, and Pike had handled it, and now Pike was dead, what had she told him to do? And what had someone killed him to keep buried? Chapter 3. The unopened envelope of Marleycombe. The morning after morning came to Marleycombe with a hush, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Shops opened more slowly than usual. Curtains twitched, but stayed closed longer. Children were quieter. Even the birds outside St. Mildred's Church sang a more subdued song. Inside the post office, Miss Maudie Perkins, a sharp-nosed woman with a nose for scandal-sorted letters with extra attention. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she paused at an envelope addressed to Mr. Leonard Pike, Esq., in her delicate black ink script. Too late for this one, she muttered to herself. She set it aside with a sigh, then reached for the next. But her eyes kept flicking back to that envelope. It bore no return address, only a crimson wax seal, slightly smudged. Curious, very curious. She made a mental note to mention it to her sister, who happened to clean at the VICARAGE dot by 10 o'clock. The envelope would become a quiet footnote in the ever-swelling tale that was overtaking the village. Meanwhile, at the Garden of Echoes, the soil still bore the bruises of violence. Detective Inspector Callan Renner arrived from the county constabulary. Tall, lean, and only recently transferred from London, Renner had the weary air of a man who believed people lied more often than not, and was rarely surprised when they did. He stood with Sergeant Little beside the sundial. "You're sure it was moved?" Renner asked, crouching. Little nodded. The girl Gilly Hart noticed. said it was misaligned. Renner's fingers brushed the base. There were indeed fresh scratches around the bolts, a subtle disturbance in the earth. Something had been tampered with. He looked at the footprints nearby, some fresh, others already fading into the morning dew. Have you searched beneath it? Little shook his head. Not yet. Renner stood. Do it, carefully. As the constables began their work, Renner glanced toward the far bench, where a certain elderly lady sat knitting quietly, as if she were waiting for a bus rather than observing a murder scene. He knew of Miss Marple. All the officers in the district did. He wasn't yet sure whether to find her irritating or invaluable. She caught his gaze and gave him a pleasant nod. Lovely weather for digging, Inspector. He nodded back. We'll see what we find. She returned to her knitting, but her fingers had slowed slightly. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple added a new page to her notebook. Clue number 4. Sundial shifted deliberately. Not to mark time, to mark place. Clue number 5. Roger Edivane's reaction stiff. Not grief, but inconvenience. Clue number 6. Gilly Hart. Nervous, but precise. Not a liar. She paused, then made a small addition under clue number 4. Possibly buried item. Document? Object? Something worth killing for. Just as she set down her pen, the doorbell rang. It was Dolly Bantry. Jane, she said breathlessly, you'll never believe this. That inspector man, they've found something under the sundial. At Fernley, a small box had been exhumed. Wooden, lacquered, with brass hinges and a tarnished keyhole. It had been buried only an inch or two deep, clearly meant to be found. Again, inside. A bundle of documents sealed in a waxed paper sleeve. And on top, a folded note. Detective Inspector Renner read aloud. For safekeeping until I return. Do not open unless I fail to make contact by April 3rd, LP. April 3rd, Renner murmured, checking his watch. Today's the 4th. He unfolded the first page in the packet. It was a will, a revised version of Lady Margaret Edivane's last testament. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Gilly Hart stood on her doorstep, damp from the mist. I'm sorry to bother you, she said softly. I didn't know who else to ask. Miss Marple ushered her in at once, guiding her to the fireplace. Have some tea, she said. You look like you've been haunted. Gilly's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup. I think someone followed me last night, she said. After I left Fernley, I heard footsteps. I turned, but no one was there. Then, when I got home, my notes had been moved. The page about the sundial's alignment, it was gone. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained calm. You believe someone wanted to know what you'd noticed? Yes. Do you know who? Gilly hesitated. Then Roger, maybe. Or maybe someone else. Someone from London. Leonard Pike mentioned a man with a walking stick who'd visited last week, claimed to be a distant cousin of Lady Margaret's. But no one's seen him since. Miss Marple sat back, silent. A man with a walking stick, she repeated. And did he leave a name? No, only that he was interested in the garden's hidden histories. That's what Leonard told me. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the hearth, where the fire hissed softly. Hidden histories. Illy, she said gently. If you have any more of your notes, keep them safe. Not in your home. Somewhere unexpected. Somewhere only you know. Gilly nodded, visibly shaken. I'll come again tomorrow, she said, rising. Miss Marple watched her go, then stood and drew the curtain. A figure moved beyond the hedgerow, a shadow that paused too long before disappearing into the mist. Chapter 4. The man with the walking stick. Marley Combe. Fog and footsteps. The mist lingered well past dawn this next morning, shrouding Marley Combe in a damp hush that dulled color and sound alike. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Miss Marple, early to rise as ever, stepped into her garden in a knitted shawl and rubber boots. She clipped a few errant rose branches, her hands as steady as ever, and took note of a curious trail in the dew, a path broken by a single narrow indentation, repeated at intervals. A walking stick, not just any kind. The kind with a metal tip, followed it quietly as it passed her gate, moved along the lane, and stopped abruptly at the broken fence behind the vicarage. Then it vanished into the brush, where footprints faded into mud. It had rained during the night. Whoever had been here had either left early, or never left at all. She returned inside with the rose clippings and sat at her kitchen table. A slice of fruit cake, a small notebook, and her thoughts were her companion's. At the police station, Inspector Renner was reviewing the contents of the exhumed box. The revised will was signed, witnessed, and dated only 1 week before Lady Margaret's death. A single change had been made, one that shifted the balance of everything. Instead of leaving the estate solely to Roger Edivane, she had added a second heir, Gilly Hart, designated as co-beneficiary, with a special clause granting her lifetime residence at Fernley House and stewardship of its historical archives. With a special clause granting her lifetime residence at Fernley House and stewardship of its historical archives. Odd choice, muttered Renner. Family to a stranger. She wasn't family, said Little, reading over his shoulder. No, but she was trusted. Renner flipped the page. A second document. It appeared to be an old letter, Lady Margaret's handwriting again. Roger must never know the full history of Fernley. Some things are better buried, but Gilly understands. She cares about the truth more than her inheritance, which is precisely why she deserves it. He set it down slowly. A secret in the garden. Something Gilly may have known, or would have uncovered eventually. Little scratched his chin. Makes Roger a pretty tidy suspect, doesn't it? Yes, said Renner. Too tidy. Meanwhile, Gilly Hart sat in the quiet of the Marleycombe Library archives, sifting through brittle blueprints and hand-drawn maps. She paused over a diagram labeled Garden South 1874 Restoration. A small circle had been marked beneath the wisteria, annotated only with the letters W.R. She frowned. She'd seen those initials before. Turning to a separate binder of family records, she found it Walter Renshaw, a cousin of the Edivane family, declared missing in 1893. His name had been scratched out in some versions of the tree, restored. In others, what was odd, however, was not the name it was a small margin note next to it, in a different hand entirely. Confessed to Margaret. Buried truth with him. Echoes remain. A chill ran through her. Was this what Lady Margaret had meant? What Leonard Pike had been researching before he died? She didn't hear the creak of the door behind her until it was nearly too late. "Hello, Miss Hart?" came a voice. Gilly turned. Startled, a man stood just inside the doorway. He wore a gray overcoat and held a cane with a silver tip. His face was thin, his smile precise. "Apologies for frightening you," he said. "I believe we have mutual interests." At that same hour, Miss Marple was in conversation with Reverend Mayhew at the vicarage. "She mentioned something about a cousin years ago," said the Reverend, eyes narrowed in thought. "A man with a scandal, if I recall. Walter Renshaw. Quite a tragic story. Did he live in Fernley?" asked Miss Marple. "Oh, no," said Mayhew. "He was removed after some family unpleasantness. There were rumors about debts or something darker, but the records are vague. Not many people talk about him." "Because they were told not to?" Mayhew looked mildly uncomfortable. "You know how it is in old families. Silence is a kind of inheritance." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you ever meet a man with a walking stick? Thin, pale, Possibly claiming to be a Renshaw? Mayhew blinked. Not recently. Though now that you mention it, one came to the Good Friday service, sat in the back, left before communion. I thought he was a pilgrim. Miss Marple stood. I think he may be something far less holy. Inside the archive, Gilly tried to stay calm. You're the cousin, she said. The one Margaret never mentioned. The man smiled politely. Not quite. Let's just say I'm interested in family matters. And in what's been left behind. You're clever. You must know by now what Margaret was protecting. I only know there's something missing, said Gilly carefully. Something Pike found. The man's face tightened almost imperceptibly. That's unfortunate, he said. Pike was careless. Trusted the wrong people. You won't make the same mistake, I hope. Gilly took a step backward, hand drifting toward the desk where her satchel lay. I've already shared the documents with the inspector. She lied. The man smiled again, but his eyes were ice. And I suppose it's too late. He turned and walked out. Only once he was gone did Gilly collapse into the chair, breath trembling. She reached into her bag, not for her phone, but for the slip of paper she'd taken from the archives. 3 words stared back at her. Vault. Echo key. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed a fresh cup of tea in front of Inspector Renner. He looked worn but curious. You think this Renshaw fellow is behind Pike's murder? I think, Miss Marple said gently, we must ask ourselves, what was Pike afraid of? He buried those documents. He gave a specific date. He knew someone might silence him, and yet he did not go to the police. That tells me he feared not just murder, but exposure of something he may have been part of. Renner folded his arms. You're saying Pike wasn't just a victim? Miss Marple gave him a kindly look. I'm saying he was a solicitor, and solicitors rarely die for other people's secrets. Chapter 5. The Vault Beneath the Venice Fernley House, Midnight the moon crept slowly across the garden at Fernley House, casting long silver streaks across the overgrown hedges and stone paths. It was quiet, eerily so, as if the house itself were listening. Roger Edivane stood at the study window, smoking his 3rd cigarette of the night. His shirt collar was loosened, his tie undone. A tumbler of whiskey sat on the edge of the desk. Untouched, he stared toward the garden, toward the sundial. He had heard the news, the will, the box, the co-air dot. It was all unraveling now. Everything Aunt Margaret had promised. All those quiet assurances during her final weeks. Don't worry, Roger. It's all yours. You've sacrificed enough. And yet she had lied. Lied with a smile and a lavender-scented envelope about his inheritance. His life was being stolen by a girl who sorted dusty papers and planted roses for a hobby. He crushed the cigarette into the ashtray, then glanced down at a folder on the desk dot inside. A copy of Gilly's article for the Marleycombe Historical Review, an annotated family tree, and a photograph grainy, zoomed in of a man with a walking stick boarding a train. There was no name written on the back, just a date, the 29th of March. Meanwhile, at the far end of the village, Gilly Hart was pacing the archive building. Though she'd locked the doors and drawn the blinds, sleep remained impossibly out of reach. She turned again to the map from 1874. One marked War, and vault access cloaked. She hadn't shown this to Inspector Renner yet. Something about it felt too vulnerable, as if once it left her hands, it would be lost in official files and locked drawers. She traced her finger over a small marking near the garden's south end. It looked like a well, but it wasn't labeled as such, and the phrase scribbled beside it, Echo Key, kept ringing in her mind. She turned to a second, older blueprint from 1831. In the same spot was an annotation. Access tunnel, sealed post-incident. Chapel. Crypt origin. Gilly sat back. A sealed tunnel. Beneath the garden. Leading from the old family crypt behind the village chapel. Could that be what Lady Margaret had tried to protect? The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard. Basket in hand, under the pretense of visiting the graves of two distant cousins, twins who had drowned in the great flood of '09. Reverend Mayhew greeted her politely. "Such a misty morning again," he said. "The whole place feels cloaked." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, eyes scanning the moss-covered gravestones. "May I ask, has anyone been down to the Edivane crypt lately?" The vicar hesitated. "Not since last summer. It's sealed, you know. Iron gate. Locked, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple nodded. "Though locks, in my experience, are a very temporary sort of thing." She stepped carefully over the cobblestones toward the chapel's rear. The family crypt stood in the shadow of a large yew tree. The gate was rusted, the path littered with fallen leaves, but the lock was new, very new. Polished brass, free of rust, with a faint scratch near the keyhole. Someone had been inside. Recently. That afternoon. Inspector Renner called a village. Meeting at the town hall, a tactic used rarely, but wisely, when the locals' tongues moved faster than his inquiries. The room filled quickly. Grocers, gardeners, shopkeepers, Mrs. Penelope Farrow in her best hat, and Rosa Dobbs with a notebook. She pretended was for knitting patterns. Miss Marple took her seat near the front, beside Dr. Hayburn and the librarian, who smelled faintly of linseed oil and dusty ink. Renner stepped up to the small dais. "There's no easy way to say this," he began. "But what happened to Mr. Pike was not an accident. He was murdered, struck with deliberate force, in a location chosen for concealment, not convenience." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. "And now," he continued, "we know that something was being hidden beneath that sundial. A revised will, signed and sealed by Lady Margaret Edivane. One that directly contradicts the inheritance currently under review." Eyes turned toward Roger, seated stiffly in the back. Renner's gaze swept across the room. "There is also evidence that someone has been accessing private family records, and possibly a sealed crypt, beneath the chapel grounds. We are looking into the possibility that an unacknowledged heir or long-lost relative may be involved." The words hung heavy. It was Miss Marple who finally broke the silence, her voice calm and clear. "Perhaps," she said, "we should stop, assuming the killer is trying to gain something, and consider that they may be trying to hide something instead." All heads turned. She smiled gently, fingers folded in her lap. "After all," she added, "Lady Margaret was a clever woman. If she revised her will, it was not simply to reward loyalty. It was, perhaps, to protect a truth even older than Fernley itself." That evening, as mist once again crept in from the hills, Roger Edivane stood alone in the wisteria garden. He held a spade in one hand, a lantern in the other, and he wasn't alone. A voice came from the shadows. Calm, firm, unshaking. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Edivane." Roger froze. Inspector Renner stepped into the clearing, Miss Marple at his side. The lantern's glow revealed the place. Roger had started to dig just inches from where the sundial had once stood. "You've come to destroy it," said Miss Marple, "whatever Margaret buried. Not because it threatens your inheritance, but because it threatens your name." Roger's eyes flickered. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do," she said. "Walter Renshaw didn't disappear. He died here, and your family buried the truth beneath flowers and time." The silence stretched. Then Roger lowered the spade and said nothing. Chapter 6. Bones in the Earth. Marleycombe. 2 days later, by the following morning, Marleycombe had become a village divided not by conflict, but by silence. Some spoke in lowered voices on their doorsteps, wondering whether Roger Edivane would be arrested. Others retreated entirely into their parlors, curtains drawn and radios humming faintly in the background. But all waited. Waited for word. Waited for truth. It came not with a headline, but a shovel at precisely 11:07 a.m., under the supervision of Inspector Renner and 2 constables. Excavation began beneath the wisteria arbor where Roger had been caught. The soil was loamy, soft in places, compacted in others. A few feet down, the spade struck something hard. Not stone, not metal. Bone. Miss Marple stood on the garden's edge, hands tucked into her cardigan, observing quietly as the constables worked. She did not flinch when the remains were revealed. A partial skeleton, long buried, curled as if in sleep. Beside the bones lay remnants of a tattered cloth, once a waistcoat, perhaps an a rusted watch, the hands frozen at 3:19, a few inches. Further, unearthed with gentle fingers, was a crumbling leather-bound notebook. Inspector Renner picked it up carefully, brushing dirt from the cover. Inside, faded ink barely clung to the pages, but enough could be read. Cannot live with what we've done. Margaret begged me to stay quiet. They'll never understand. The truth would ruin them. But my silence weighs heavier than sin. I'm sealing this place tonight. Walter. Renner exhaled slowly, then looked toward Miss Marple. He was buried here on purpose. By someone he trusted. She nodded. And someone who feared what would happen if he ever told the truth. The remains were taken under police escort to the coroner's office in Elmsworth. Within hours, confirmation came. Male, aged approximately. Mid-40s at time of death, consistent with Walter Renshaw's physical description. Cause of death: blunt trauma to the back of the skull. Murder. The case was no longer about Leonard Pike alone. Now it spanned generations. Later that afternoon, Roger Edivane sat in the drawing room at Fernley, wrists free but under watch. Inspector Renner stood nearby, arms folded. Miss Marple remained silent until she'd taken her place on the settee. "Roger," she said gently, "I don't believe you killed Mr. Pike. You may be entitled and selfish, but you're not a murderer." Roger's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. "What I do believe," she continued, "is that you discovered the truth about Walter Renshaw, and instead of letting it surface, you tried to bury it again." "I had no choice," Roger muttered. "If people found out about Walter, about the scandal, it would destroy the family name. Margaret wanted it forgotten." "No," said Miss Marple. "She wanted it preserved. Hidden for a time, yes, but not erased." Renner stepped forward. "What happened the night Pike died?" Roger swallowed hard. "He called me. Said he was going to file the revised will the next day. I told him to wait, that I needed time. He didn't listen." "Did you confront him?" Roger nodded. "In the garden, early, just after dawn. I begged him to delay. He laughed. Said history had already changed, and I was a footnote. And then?" Roger looked down. "I left. I was angry. But I didn't kill him." Miss Marple believed him. Because something didn't fit. Pike's body had been found with a bent garden trowel. But Roger had an old wrist injury. He couldn't have delivered a fatal blow with such force, even in anger. That evening, Gilly Hart returned to the archives. She moved carefully now, always checking over her shoulder. The image of the man with the walking stick, the stranger, still haunted her. Thoughts. She approached the locked drawer where she'd hidden the Echo key map. Her heart sank. The lock was broken. The folder was gone. And in its place, a single item had been left. A pressed wisteria blossom. Miss Marple sat at her desk late that night, a single candle flickering beside her teacup. She had laid out all her notes, her clippings, her sketches. Everything pointed to Walter Renshaw's death as the central truth. But there was still one question that refused to go away. Why did Pike? Bury the new will beneath the sundial. Why not simply send it to the solicitor's office? The answer, she realized, was painfully simple, because he knew someone was watching him. Someone he didn't trust. Someone from within the village. She turned slowly toward her mantel, where an old photograph of Lady Margaret rested. In the background, barely noticeable, was a familiar man. Leaning on a cane. Miss Marple picked up the photo with trembling fingers. "You clever, tragic woman," she whispered. "You didn't just bury the truth. You buried the killer's name." End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. A voice from the past Marleycombe. The storm breaks the next morning arrived in fury. Rain lashed the rooftops of Marleycombe. The wind bent the hedges low, rattled shutters, and sent chimney smoke spiraling sideways. It was as though the storm had waited patiently for the right moment to descend, just as secrets had waited beneath the earth. Inside her quiet cottage, Miss Marple watched the weather through her lace-curtained window, a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders. She had not slept. She didn't need more clues. She needed confirmation. She turned to the old photograph again. Lady Margaret at a summer fete, wisteria in full bloom, and just behind her, slightly blurred but unmistakable, a man leaning on. A cane, eyes sharp, head turned just slightly toward the camera. He had no name in the village, but she knew who he was now. The man had returned, and he was far from done. Across the village, Gilly Hart arrived at the vicarage soaked to the bone. Her hair clung to her face, and her hands trembled as she held out the wisteria blossom. "I found it in the archive," she said. He took the map, the one showing the vault beneath the garden. He left this. Reverend Mayhew, though elderly and mild, turned grave. "You believe this man is the one who killed Pike?" "I know." "He is," Gilly whispered. "He confronted me once already. He's after whatever Margaret tried to hide. And now he knows that I know where it leads." The vicar looked to the storm-blurred window. "Then we must tell the inspector." "No," said Gilly. "We must tell her." By mid-morning, Miss Marple was already preparing a bag-sewing kit, small torch, her black umbrella, and a single folded map. She welcomed Gilly inside with a dry towel and a calm nod, as if she had been expecting her. "I think he's searching for something buried in the vault," Gilly said. "Something Lady Margaret knew he'd come for." Miss Marple poured tea. "Then let's make sure he finds it in our company." By early afternoon, Miss Marple, Gilly, and Inspector Renner stood in the shadow of the old chapel. The iron gate to the Edivane crypt groaning open before them. The storm had eased into steady rain, enough to slick the stones and make every step echo. "Are you certain he'll come?" asked Renner, his hand near his coat pocket, where a small revolver was discreetly tucked. "He's waited over 30 years, Miss Marple replied softly. "He won't miss this." They descended. The air grew colder, thick with damp and dust. The passage was narrow, lined with old stone and carved names. Edivane, Renshaw, Thomasine, Algernon. At the far end, hidden behind a collapsed stone altar, was the sealed entrance Pike's map had hinted at. A loose brick, a rusted lever, and then a click. The wall shifted. A vault door, old and iron, creaked open with a reluctant groan. Inside was a narrow chamber, lit only by the inspector's torch. Dust coated every surface. In the center sat a single wooden chest, long and flat, chained shut and marked with wax seals long broken. Renner stepped forward cautiously. "Do we open it?" he asked. "No," said Miss Marple. "We wait." It was only minutes before the echoing steps reached them, measured, calm, a cane tapping against stone. The man stepped into view dry despite the rain, eyes sharp beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Charming," he said, "just as I left it." Renner raised his torch. "Name?" The man smiled. Edward Renshaw, son of Walter, born in exile, raised in debt, taught to believe a legacy was stolen. Miss Marple stepped forward, calm and precise. You believe Lady Margaret wronged your father. I know she did. He died here, didn't he? In this hole, like a secret you are too afraid to bury properly. She silenced him. She did know. Such thing, Miss Marple said gently. Walter came to her to confess because he had killed someone, not out of vengeance, out of fear. And she protected him out of love. Edward blinked. What? Miss Marple's voice was low. He killed his brother Margaret's first husband, accidentally, during an argument over inheritance. There were no other witnesses. The family sealed it away. They hid the truth for decades. But Pike found letters records Walter left behind. Margaret revised her will to protect the truth and to offer you a legacy that wasn't soaked in lies. Edward's hands clenched on the cane. No, you're lying. Pike promised me he'd restore our name. Then he backed out. Because he read the truth, said Gilly quietly. He realized it wasn't theft, it was guilt. That your father's shame was not a robbery, but a burden. For a long moment, Edward stood frozen. Then his eyes darkened. Then I've done all this for nothing. Renner stepped forward. You murdered a man for a past you never understood. Edward turned, but too late. The constables appeared behind him, weapons drawn. He dropped the cane. It clattered on stone like the final note of a long-forgotten song. Later that night, back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a single candle and finally opened the old notebook Walter had left behind. Inside, barely visible, was a line that had been missed before. Let the echoes die here, in the soil where we lied, and let no more blood feed the garden. She closed it gently. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the garden slept again. Chapter 8. The quiet return. Marley Combe. 1 week later, the rain had stopped. The sun, shy at first, broke gently through the morning mist that clung to the hedgerows. Marley Combe had returned to its rhythm, slow, habitual, quietly watchful. But something in its stillness had changed. There was no grand headline, no front-page declaration in the Marley Combe Gazette. Just a short, careful article near the bottom of page 2. Edward Renshaw in custody over. Death of solicitor. Investigation into the historical connection between the Renshaw and Edivane families continues. Police confirm recovery of sealed family documents and anticipate further legal clarification of inheritance claims. Local authorities thank residents for their cooperation. To the villagers, the article confirmed what they already half knew and what they would now, forever, half speak of in tea-shops and hedgerows. Marley Combe had a past, a darker one than they'd supposed, but no one mentioned it too loudly. At Fernley House, Gilly Hart walked the south garden path with pruning shears in hand. The police tape was gone. The sundial had been reinstalled, cleaned, recentered, and now perfectly aligned. Beneath it, the soil had been resettled, the grass reseeded. It looked as though nothing had happened, except that everything had. She paused beneath the wisteria archway, where purple blossoms spilled overhead like falling silk. For a long moment she stood still, listening. It was quiet now. No echo. She turned toward the house. Inside, renovation had begun. Roger had agreed reluctantly to let Gilly stay and manage the estate's archives as co-trustee, in accordance with Lady Margaret's final will. He would keep the family name, but not the power to rewrite its history. That was Gilly's now, and she would protect it. Miss Marple received a letter that afternoon, written in an elegant hand on thick cream paper. It was unsigned, but she knew. The writer by tone alone. You were right, of course. I never did see the truth, not really. I mistook legacy for identity, inheritance for justice. I never once thought to ask who we became when the stories changed. I hope Fernley is in better hands now. I won't return." There was no address. She folded the letter and placed it into a drawer labeled "Unfinished Business Closed." Then she returned to her knitting, finishing a pair of lavender gloves for a birthday that no one remembered but her. The next Sunday, Miss Marple attended church at St. Mildred's, where the organ wheezed cheerfully and Reverend Mayhew preached. On the burden of silence. "Sometimes," he said, "it is not noise that causes pain, but the absence of truth." After the service, Miss Marple stayed behind, as she often did, arranging the small vases on the altar. Gilly approached, holding a folded paper. "I found this behind one of the old hymnals," she said. "It's Lady Margaret's writing. A poem, or maybe just a thought." Miss Marple read the lines aloud, softly. "In gardens bloom both rose and thorn, where secrets sleep and truths are born. Let echoes speak where none shall tread, and judge the living by the dead." She looked up at Gilly and smiled. "I think that's her final word on the matter." Outside, the village went on. A dog barked near the butcher's. Someone argued faintly about marmalade, and the postman waved at two boys, racing on bicycles. All was as it had been. And yet, if you listened closely in the garden at Fernley. Just after dusk, when the breeze moved through the wisteria and the sundial cast a long shadow across the earth, you might still hear something faint and far. Away, not a cry, not a whisper, but a memory. An echo. And Miss Marple, seated in her garden with tea and biscuits, would tell you, if you asked kindly enough. Some mysteries are solved not with proof, but with peace. Chapter 9. Tea with the Truth St. Mary Mead, A. Week later, Miss Marple rarely left Marleycombe during a case, but once all was settled, or at least tidily placed in its proper corners, she returned home to St. Mary. Mead. Her rose garden had grown a little wild in her absence. She didn't mind. Nature, like people, tended to thrive when not overly controlled. She had barely unpacked when there came a knock at the door. "Come in, dear," she called, already knowing the knock. Dolly Bantry entered in a flurry of perfume and impatience, a folded newspaper under one arm and curiosity sparkling in her eyes. "You didn't tell me it was that exciting," she said, sitting without invitation. "Murder, inheritance, a crypt, and a long-lost heir? I've had to hear it all second-hand from Mrs. Castle down at the grocer's, who heard it from her niece, who thinks she saw a constable weeping near the wisteria." Miss Marple poured the tea without so much as a flinch. "You mustn't believe everything that comes through village telephone wires, Dolly. It distorts halfway through and multiplies by the time it reaches the receiver." "Still," said Dolly, watching her, "it was rather extraordinary, wasn't it?" "Yes, Miss Marple admitted, but not because of the murder. No?" "No," she repeated, setting down the teapot. "It was extraordinary because of the reason behind it. You see, Dolly, people will kill for many things: money, passion, jealousy, but the most dangerous motive is always the one that sounds noble." Dolly blinked. "What do you mean?" "Redemption," said Miss Marple softly. "When someone thinks they're righting a wrong from the past, that they're cleaning up someone else's sin, they can justify anything." That same day, in a solicitor's office in Elmsworth, the new will of Lady Margaret Edivane was finally processed. 2 names were officially listed as beneficiaries: Roger Edivane and Gillian Hart. The house would remain jointly owned. The archives would become a public heritage project. And a sealed letter was delivered. One Margaret had left behind. It was addressed simply to whoever finally listens. The letter was short. "I loved Walter, but I could not protect him forever. I built a garden over the truth, hoping that time would soften it. Perhaps I was wrong to hide it. Perhaps not. If you've found this, then you've gone deeper than most, Thank you. Let Fernley belong to honesty now. Let no echo be louder than kindness. Margaret later that evening in Marleycombe, Gilly. Hart sat in the fernless study, the firelight flickering across her face. She had taken to wearing her hair tied up, not out of vanity, but out of focus. There was much work to do. She had just finished sorting a box of old journals when she found a single loose page, tucked between two copies of the Fernley Ledger. 1890. It was written in Leonard Pike's neat, slanted script. I don't fear death, only misinterpretation. If I die, please let it be known. I was trying to protect the story, not the family. She folded it gently, slid it into a fresh folder, and labeled it Primary Sources Motives. Miss Marple, that evening, walked slowly through her own garden, the petals wet with dew, the stars only just beginning to emerge. She paused by the bird bath, where a single robin landed and chirped curiously. Back again, are you? She murmured. She sat on the bench, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and allowed herself one small smile. The case was not just about a body in the garden. It was about what we bury, and why, and what grows, despite us. Chapter 10. An invitation and a threat. Fernley House. Mid-April. Garden was blooming with unseasonal vigour. The wisteria arched higher, lavender tendrils thick as ever, and then roses along the west wall once ignored, now bloomed in careful symmetry. The estate no longer felt haunted. Instead, it felt watched, not by ghosts, but by memory. Gilly Hart moved with quiet purpose through the Fernley drawing room. A long mahogany table was laid out with archival materials, family records, land deeds, correspondence, and a growing binder marked Restoration. Proposal, Fernley as Historical Trust. She had just added the last signature to the paperwork when she noticed something on the table that hadn't been there earlier. An envelope. Cream-colored, thick, sealed in red wax. No stamp. No handwriting. No trace of how it arrived. She stared at it for a moment before breaking the seal. Inside, a single card, hand-typed. You may own the house, but you've only scratched the surface. Not all roots stay buried. Some still reach for blood. Number. Name. No signature. Gilly looked quickly around the room, her heart thudding. The windows were closed, the doors locked, and yet someone had been here. Across the village, Miss Marple was enjoying her second slice of lemon sponge in the Rosehill tea room when her telephone rang, something that only happened in urgent matters. The staff knew to forward calls to the small corner booth when she was out. She rose, excused herself, and took the receiver. Miss Marple? Gilly's voice trembled slightly. I found something. No, someone left something. Slowly. Dear, what did they leave? She told her. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Describe the envelope. She did. And the card? Yes. There was a pause. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then asked quietly, Are you alone in the house? Yes, Gilly whispered. Then I suggest you leave. By the time Gilly reached Miss Marple's cottage 20 minutes later, she was visibly shaken. She placed the card on the table. Miss Marple turned it under the lamplight. Typed on a Smith Corona, she murmured. American model. Post-war. The kind favored by certain legal offices and ironically con men. Gilly blinked. You think it's a warning? No. Dear, Miss Marple said, it's an invitation. Invitation? Yes, she said, to dig deeper, which means there's more to find. She tapped the corner of the card. Roots, he said. Which makes me wonder, if Walter Renshaw's secret was buried under the garden, what might still lie beneath the house? Later that evening, Inspector Renner joined them in Fernley's cellar, once a wine room, now long disused. He swept his torch across the stonework. Seemed solid, he said. Old but not unusual, Miss Marple touched the mortar gently. Yes, except this section here, see? Newer plaster. Possibly redone to cover something. They began tapping methodically. It was Gilly who found the hollow echo. They paused. Here, she whispered, behind this shelf. Renner helped pull the shelving unit aside. Behind it, a stone slab out of place in shape and color was set into the wall. Miss Marple pressed against it. It gave. A narrow panel opened, revealing a short corridor of stone steps descending into dark. Renner drew his torch again. After you, he said grimly. They descended. The chamber beneath was no more than 10 feet by 10, but it had once been used. Dust lay thick on the ground, but in one corner were remnants of furniture. A small desk, a stool, and a writing box. And on the wall, carved crudely into the stone, he never left. Gilly shivered. They searched carefully. Inside the writing box were documents. Dozens of them. Letters from Walter Renshaw. Some addressed to Margaret. Others to no one at all. My brother's blood is still on my hands. She says we can start over, but the past does not forgive. Edward will come one day, and he will not understand. Miss Marple read them with a strange sadness. He was waiting for someone to redeem him, she said quietly. But no one ever came. Renner nodded. We'll take these in. Could be important for the inquest? And the threat to Gilly? Miss Marple asked. Renner hesitated. Could be a hoax. Or someone who still thinks Fernley's secrets are worth something. Miss Marple looked at the carved message again. Or someone who knows the house is not done speaking. That night, Gilly stayed at the village inn. Fernley sat in the dark, still and breathless. But in the cellar, past the loosened panel and the writing box now emptied, a second hidden drawer remained unopened. Inside it, untouched, waited something no one had yet seen. A key and a deed. Not to Fernley, but to a second estate. One Margaret had kept hidden her entire life. Chapter 11. The second house, Marley Combe. The next morning, the morning fog crept slowly across Marley Combe, like spilled milk, drifting between the hedges and stone walls, as if trying to remember where it had left something behind. Miss Marple stood at the breakfast table, carefully buttering a scone, when the knock came. She opened the door to find Inspector Renner, looking both tired and curious, holding a manila envelope. Thought you'd want to see this first, he said. We went back into the Fernley cellar early this morning. Gilly's documents were only part of the story. Inside the envelope were photographs, clearly taken by constables during a secondary search of the hidden chamber. Miss Marple paused on one image. A small drawer slid open, revealing a key bound in velvet ribbon, and a folded deed stamped and yellowed with age. She looked up. It's real? She asked. It's very real, said Renner. A second property, north of Elmsworth. Registered in 1953 under the name M.E.R. Holdings, Margaret Edevan Renshaw. Renshaw, Miss Marple repeated. She never sold it, never mentioned it in the revised will. Not even to Pike, as far as we can tell. The house is listed as derelict, abandoned for decades. Miss Marple considered this, then said quietly, And what is its name? Renner hesitated, then read from his notes. Echo House. 2 hours later, Miss Marple, Gilly Hart, and Inspector Renner stood at the gate of a large, ivy-cloaked manor tucked deep into the hills, half swallowed by woodland. Echo House did not announce itself grandly. It stood like a memory, might unmoving, weathered, waiting. The gate creaked as they passed through. Why keep this secret? Gilly asked softly. Why hide a whole house? Perhaps because what was hidden inside was never meant to be found, Miss Marple replied. Or perhaps Margaret knew that eventually someone would need to find it. The key turned in the lock with an audible click. The front door groaned open. Dust danced in the stillness. Furniture stood covered in sheets. Portraits hung in faded frames. A fireplace, unused for decades, was choked with cobwebs. And on the mantel, standing alone in the gloom, was a photograph in a silver frame. Gilly picked it up and gasped. It was Walter Renshaw. Younger, smiling slightly, and beside him Margaret. Not as the cold matriarch of Fernley, but young, radiant, and visibly pregnant. No one ever mentioned a child, whispered Gilly. Because that child, said Miss Marple, was likely born out of wedlock. Gilly turned to her. Then who? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Edward Renshaw may not have just believed he was Walter's son. He was. They explored the house slowly, careful not to disturb anything. Most of the furniture had been left intact. Papers were neatly filed in locked cabinets. Dust lay like a second skin over all of it. In the upstairs study, they found the rest of the truth. A bundle of letters written by Margaret to someone named Aunt Lillian, all dated between 1953 and 1956. I cannot raise him here. Fernley would swallow him whole. Let him grow elsewhere away from this legacy. I will send money. But let him forget my name. When he is old enough, even this key, let him choose whether to return. Renner. Put the paper down slowly. So Edward was not just after revenge. No, said Miss Marple. He was after belonging. He thought Margaret had stolen his father's legacy. But in truth, Margaret had tried to protect him. Gilly stared at the window. He came home, and he didn't even know it. Outside, as the wind stirred the ivy and birds moved between the trees, Miss Marple walked alone through the back garden of Echo House. She found an old stone bench, worn smooth by time, and sat. It overlooked a dry fountain and rows of overgrown hydrangeas. But there was peace in it. A kind of forgotten peace. She took out her notebook and wrote just 3 words. Some silence is mercy. Back in the village, the news began to ripple quietly at first. Then, with soft interest. The house Margaret had hidden, the child she never claimed. And the life that had come full circle in the shape of a murder. That evening, Gilly sat at Fernley and read through the deed again. Her name was now attached to both estates Fernley and Echo House. A dual legacy. She didn't know what she would do with the second one. Not yet, but something in her had shifted. The past was no longer heavy. It was real. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead late that night, a new rose clipping in her handbag and a parcel of old letters to file. She placed the clipping in her garden, beside the bench where she so often thought, and smiled faintly to herself. Let them bloom again. Let the garden forget. But let the truth remain. Chapter 12. The name on the locket-testee. Mary Mead. 2 days later. It was the sound of the post landing on the mat that interrupted Miss Marple's peaceful breakfast. She didn't often rush to check the mail. Time, after all, rarely delivered anything more pressing than an invitation to tea or a church notice. But this morning's envelope was different, smaller, heavier, no return address. Pale blue parchment sealed in faded gold wax. Opened it carefully. Inside was a single object, a golden locket on a fine chain, intricately etched, clearly old, and unmistakably valuable. Inside the locket was a tiny portrait of a child, no more than a year old, with dark hair and solemn eyes. Opposite the image was a name, engraved with great delicacy. Edward M. Renshaw, born July 17, 1954. Marple's hands were still. Then she folded the note tucked beneath the locket. You were right. I was looking for a thief, but found my mother. I never hated her. I just never knew she tried to save me. Thank you for showing me the garden. Not just the grave. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. At Fernley. Gilly stood before a wooden cabinet she'd yet to open. It had been locked with a simple brass mechanism tucked behind the shelves of gardening books and piano scores. Now, with the master key finally delivered by the solicitor, she clicked it open. Inside were velvet-lined drawers, carefully labeled photos, letters, estate plans, keepsakes. In the smallest drawer, lined in silk, she found a faded pink ribbon and a pressed wisteria blossom perfectly preserved. Folded paper was pinned beneath it. For the girl who finds the truth, I hope the world is kinder to you than it was to me. Gilly smiled, though her eyes welled. For the first time, she no longer felt like she was walking someone else's path. Fernley wasn't just a place of mourning. It could become something new. That evening, Inspector Renner stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand. The forensics came back on the second cellar, he said. Those letters Walter wrote? Some were dictated, traced over. Margaret's handwriting is on the last few. Miss Marple nodded. So she wrote them for him? Yes, or helped him finish the confession. We think he was ill-failing memory, perhaps even early dementia. So she took the burden, Miss Marple murmured, as far as she could, until Pike uncovered it all and tried to preserve it properly. Renner hesitated. Funny thing, though, Pike's notebook mentioned another party, someone who approached him before Roger, someone he referred to only as the third heir. Miss Marple turned sharply. Not Edward? No, someone else. A woman, apparently. Much younger. A relative or something else. Her fingers tightened around her teacup. Then it's not over, she said softly. Meanwhile, in a quiet boarding house in Bath, a woman unpacked her things in a modest room overlooking a rain-damp garden. She placed a satchel on the bed and opened a small notebook. Inside were clipped articles. Echo House. Hidden estate linked to Edivane line. Margaret Edivane's secret. Will? Identity of third beneficiary remains unknown. She smiled slightly, then turned to the last page, where one name was scrawled at the top in careful block print. Vivian Pike. She underlined it. Twice. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple added the locket to her small collection of tokens in a carved walnut box. She placed it next to a dried lavender sachet, a silver thimble, and a button from a long-lost uniform. Each told a story. Each had found its way to her. And now, perhaps another one was beginning. Chapter 13. The third heir. Bath. 1 week. Later, the woman, calling herself Vivian Pike, moved through the narrow corridors of the Bath Public Records Office with the grace of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. In her hands, she held 2 documents, a faded birth certificate and a FA legal petition, unsigned and unfiled. The certificate read, Vivian Margaret Pike, born September 9, 1992. Mother, Eleanor Pike. Father, Leonard Pike. And beneath the mother's name, scribbled in faint blue ink under remarks, was a strange note. Adopted at birth. Biological lineage under seal. By order of MER. She folded the document slowly, then smiled to herself. Miss Marple had suspected a third player. She hadn't, however, expected her to be blood. Back in Marleycombe, Gilly Hart opened a letter forwarded from Elmsworth. She hadn't recognized the handwriting. Inside was a note. You don't know me, but I know you inherited what should have belonged to me. I suggest we meet. There are still stories Fernley hasn't told you. Ones that could change how you see everything. Wednesday, 3 p.m., Rose Hill Inn Conservatory. Come alone. V.P. Gilly stared at the initials. She picked up the telephone and rang Miss Marple at once. That same afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village archives herself. Not the formal records, but something more fragile and far more revealing. Mrs. Cuthbert's private clippings folder, a lifetime of gossip lovingly filed under things one ought to know. And there, between the 1955 fake bake sale report and an obituary for a gardener no one remembered. She found it. Local midwife resigns after mysterious home birth. Miss Lillian Fry, midwife of over 20 years, submitted her resignation after a home birth allegedly took place at Echo House, property of Margaret Edivane. Record sealed by family solicitor. No official birth registered at the time. Questions remain unanswered. Marley Combe Gazette, August 1954, Miss Marple tapped the article gently with her finger. There had been 2 children, Walter's son, Edward, and Margaret's. The hidden daughter, Wednesday, arrived cloaked in a gray drizzle that seemed to cling to everything. The Rose Hill Inn Conservatory, usually cheerful with potted geraniums and humming teapots, felt hushed like the air before a confession. Gilly arrived 5 minutes early. She was composed, guarded. Vivian was already there, young perhaps early, 30s, elegantly dressed. Sharp eyes. She smiled, not warmly, but deliberately. You came. I always answer a challenge, Gilly replied, sitting, especially one written in someone else's legacy. Vivian tilted her head. You really don't know, do you? Know what? Vivian leaned in. My mother, Eleanor Pike, was Margaret's daughter. She had me in secret. She was meant to inherit Fernley. But she died in a car accident in 1995. I was 3. I was raised by Leonard, who never told me the truth until just before he died. And now you want the house, Gilly said flatly. Vivian smiled faintly. No, I want the truth made public. I want people to know that I'm the last of the Edivane line, not you. And if I say no, then I let the papers find out, on their own. I have birth certificates, letters. I've already spoken to a reporter from the Telegraph. Gilly studied her a moment. You're not here for justice, she said quietly. You're here for recognition. Vivian didn't deny it. That evening, Gilly walked the Fernley garden alone. Heart-heavy Miss Marple joined her near the sundial. She's angry, Gilly said. And hurt, but I don't know if she's wrong. No, Miss Marple replied gently. But not every wound entitles a person to the whole house. Some inherit scars. Others inherit healing. What matters is what you do with it. Gilly sighed. I could offer her a share. You could, said Miss Marple, but only if it's not out of guilt. They paused as a breeze rustled the wisteria overhead. Gilly looked at the old stone bench where Margaret once sat. She gave away so much to protect her children. And now they're fighting to dig her up. Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear, they're not fighting over her. They're fighting over what they think she left behind. What they don't realize is Margaret's true legacy was you. Chapter 14. The letter never sent Fernley House. The following morning, the rain had stopped in the early hours, leaving behind a world glistening with dew. Every leaf at Fernley looked polished, every window pane freshly wept upon. Gilly Hart stood in the drawing room holding a fragile, yellowed envelope. It had been found inside a false bottom of Margaret's desk drawer, hidden beneath decades of correspondence. A seal was unbroken. The ink faded to a dusty brown dot. The front read simply, To my daughter, when you are ready. Gilly hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Margaret's unmistakable script, steady and unsentimental, but warm beneath its control. My dearest, if you are reading this, then perhaps the time I feared has come. That truth must replace silence. I never raised you, but I loved you with a quiet, burning fierceness. I gave you away not because I didn't want you, but because I feared what my name would do to you, what Fernley would become in your shadow. I never imagined the secrets we kept would become heavier with age instead of lighter. If you are angry, be angry. I deserve that. But I ask one thing. Please do not judge me only by what I hid, but also by what I tried to protect. Your brother may come for the truth. Let him. The garden will reveal what it must. But you are the flower I buried in the soil, hoping no one would ever trample. With all my unspoken love. By the time Miss Marple arrived that afternoon, she found Gilly in the music room. The letter open on the piano. She meant it for Eleanor, Gilly said without turning, but she never sent it. And now it's fallen to me. Miss Marple read the letter in silence, nodding slightly as if confirming something she had long suspected. She never stopped loving them, Gilly added, voice soft. But she couldn't bring them here, not with everything else buried it. Firmly, she chose silence, said Miss Marple, which is often mistaken for cruelty. But sometimes silence is just fear. Gilly folded the letter gently. Vivian deserves to read this, she said, even if she never forgives Margaret. That evening, Gilly arranged to meet Vivian at the Elmsworth Library. The air was tense, charged with words left unsaid. I found something, Gilly said, handing her the letter. It's not proof of inheritance, but it is proof of intention. Vivian opened the envelope, read it silently, once, then again. When she finally looked up, her face was unreadable. She gave me away to save me, Vivian murmured. But she never tried to find me. She might have thought it would only make things worse, Gilly replied gently. After a long pause, Vivian handed the letter back. No, she said. It's mine. She wrote it to me, and I'm keeping it. Gilly didn't object. Vivian stood. I won't challenge the estate, she said at last, but I will tell the story. All of it. People deserve to know what Margaret did and why. Tell it kindly, Gilly said. Vivian didn't answer. She walked out into the night, Margaret's letter clutched in her hand. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple wrote a short letter of her own. To Inspector Renner, you may wish to have someone discreet observe Miss Pike, not because she's dangerous, but because people who carry a lifetime of invisible grief tend to leave ripples in quiet ponds. Fernley's pond has only just begun to settle. She sealed it and placed it near the door for the Morning Post. Then she returned to her armchair, where a fire crackled gently and a cup of lapsang cooled on the side table. The mystery had not ended, but a chapter had. Chapter 15. The ripple in the pond Marleycombe. 3 days later, life in Marleycombe had begun to settle, though not quite return to normal. At the bakery, Mrs. Linton now sold echo cakes, lavender shortbreads with candied violets, named in quiet homage to the case that had gripped the village. Children dared each other to race past Fernley's garden wall at dusk. And at the post office, people still spoke in hushed tones when Gilly Hart's name came up. At Fernley itself, Gilly moved through the estate with a new rhythm, calm, deliberate. Each drawer she opened was no longer a risk, it was a reckoning. She had taken to reading aloud from Margaret's archived letters at dusk in the drawing room, a ritual she called letting the silence hear itself. Miss Marple visited when she could, sometimes bringing scones, sometimes just silence. It was on one such evening that the doorbell rang. Not a villager, not Inspector Renner, but Vivian Pike. Again, this time she wasn't wearing elegance. She wore grief. I've had a letter, she said. You should read it. The letter, typed and unsigned, was printed on a sheet of recycled stationery and folded without a crease. You think the past is buried, but the person who took Walter's life never paid for it. Pike knew the truth and died for keeping it. I am not finished, and neither is Fernley. There was no name, no contact. Just a warning. Miss Marple read it twice. This isn't a threat, she said finally. It's a message. To who? Vivian asked. To anyone watching, Miss Marple replied, or listening. That night, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fireplace and opened her notebook again. She drew a small garden with 3 winding paths, each labeled The heir, the daughter, the witness. She drew a circle around all three and wrote one word beneath it. Echo. Then she jotted a new thought. If Walter's death was not an accident, then who truly stood to gain by silence? She thought again of Leonard Pike. Why had he kept everything? Letters, notes, even keys. Unless he had known something no one else did. Something that got him killed. She underlined another word in the notebook. Caretaker. Then she circled it 3 times. The next morning, Miss Marple took the 10:15 omnibus to Elmsworth. Her destination, the Office of Historical Lands and Holdings, where Pike had worked part-time cataloging old deeds. There, she asked to review the documentation of Echo House and any adjacent land parcels. The clerk, reluctant at first, eventually allowed her into the back room. Miss Marple, methodical as ever, went through the dusty records until she found it. Parcel 17B, Echo House, includes servants' quarters, greenhouse, and outbuilding adjacent to the walled orchard. She frowned. That outbuilding hadn't appeared in any of the letters. Gilly hadn't mentioned it. She wrote it down and left for Marleycombe at once. By the afternoon, Miss Marple stood once more with Gilly, Vivian, and Inspector Renner on the overgrown grounds behind Echo House. It's here, she said simply, pointing toward the tangled ivy mound just past the orchard wall. Renner pulled back the brush. Beneath it was a rusted door, nearly buried, hinges corroded. A padlock snapped clean through, as though forced long ago. Inside, they found a collapsed chair, a single shelf, and a pile of ash that looked oddly staged. And just beyond the shelf, a small stone wall, loosely mortared, recently disturbed. Someone tried to hide something here, Renner said grimly. They began clearing it. Behind it was a narrow alcove, where a decayed leather satchel rested, still buckled shut. Inside the satchel, 2 sealed letters, 1 pistol, and a journal belonging to Leonard Pike. Renner opened the journal. The first entry read, "They think I'm the archivist, but I am the last wall between this house and the truth. Margaret told me what happened. Walter was poisoned, and she made me promise never to tell. But secrets don't stay dead, even in gardens." The second entry read, "Edward knows. He came once in 2005. I told him nothing. I think he saw the gun." Renner looked up. This changes everything." Miss Marple simply nodded. "He was the witness," she said quietly. "The man who knew too much, and was never meant to live long enough to tell it." Chapter 16. Poison and Promise Fernley House. The same evening Inspector Renner sat at the long oak table in Fernley's drawing room. Leonard Pike's journal spread before him like an open confession. Rain ticked against the tall windows, and thunder muttered somewhere over the hills. Miss Marple sat opposite, her knitting untouched in her lap. "So Walter was poisoned," Renner said, voice low. "And Margaret knew." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "But she didn't do it." Renner glanced up. "Then who did?" Miss Marple turned a page of the journal gently, as if not to wake the truth. "Margaret found him in the garden. He was already gone. She hid the decanter, buried the evidence, told no one but me. Said she couldn't let his son grow up knowing the father had been murdered. She chose silence over scandal." Vivian stood near the fireplace, arms folded tightly. "My mother never knew." "No," Miss Marple said, "because Margaret made sure of that." Gilly Hart closed her eyes. "So who did it?" she whispered. Miss Marple looked slowly at each of them. "That," she said, "is what we must find out, and I believe we already have the clue." She reached into her handbag and pulled out the one piece no one had yet questioned, the photograph found in Echo House. Walter Renshaw, smiling beside Margaret. "There," she said, pointing at the edge. In the blurry background, just behind the arbor, stood a figure, not clearly visible, but tall, Male, holding something under one arm, a case, or a satchel. Who took this photo? Miss Marple asked softly. Vivian stepped closer. Wait, she said slowly. That's my grandfather, Leonard Pike. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple lit a small lamp and sat before her bureau. From the folds of her old scrapbook, she drew out a yellowed newspaper clipping she had kept for nearly 3 decades. Renshaw benefactor dies after sudden collapse. No foul play suspected. Walter Renshaw, former business partner of industrialist Edwin Hargreaves, died suddenly in his garden after returning from a private dinner. Cause listed as cardiac failure. Survived by no immediate family, but with large estate entangled in legal uncertainty. Below the article, in her own handwriting, Miss Marple had written, Dinner at Hargreaves' estate the night before. No autopsy. Why? She studied the clipping. Again, not Edwin Hargreaves, a forgotten name to most. But Miss Marple remembered. He had once been engaged to Margaret's sister, Beatrice, a family rivalry, a failed business merger, a betrayal. And now a connection. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Gilly at Fernley with one question. Did Margaret ever speak of a man named Hargreaves? Gilly paused. Yes, but never fondly. I think he proposed once. She said he made things disappear. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He might have made Walter disappear, too. Gilly's face paled. Are you saying Hargreaves killed Walter? No, said Miss Marple, but I believe he supplied the poison. That afternoon, Inspector Renner tracked down the original police file on Walter Renshaw's death. It had been wafer-thin, barely 3 pages. No toxicology, no fingerprints, no post-mortem. And yet an item logged under unclaimed property caught his eye. Item 4, silver cigarette case. Monogrammed E.H. He called Miss Marple immediately. By evening, they had confirmed it. Edwin Hargreaves had been present at Fernley the night before Walter's death. He had dined privately with Margaret and Walter in the garden. The silver case had been his calling card, a gift for Walter. Supposedly a peace offering after years of business dispute. Only Walter never smoked, but Margaret did, and she had kept that case, perhaps unknowingly, until the day she died. Miss Marple gathered the players in Fernley's music room that evening. Gilly, Vivian, Renner, and one new arrival, Jonathan Hargreaves, the son of Edwin. Tall, impeccably dressed, cold eyes. I'm not sure what this is about, he said. Oh, Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. I think you are. She laid the photograph on the table, then Pike's journal, then the police logbook. Then the monogram cigarette case. You see, she said gently, I believe your father poisoned Walter Renshaw. A quiet venom slipped into his port. Margaret suspected it. She chose not to accuse him. She silenced the scandal and let the past settle. Pike helped her cover it, out of loyalty or guilt. And now, she pointed at the typed threat Vivian had received. Someone else knows. And they don't want the truth to stay buried. Hargreaves stood. This is slander. No, said Renner, stepping forward. It's an investigation. That night, as thunder finally broke over Marleycombe, Miss Marple sat quietly at her desk and wrote one line in her notebook. The truth always finds its way back to the garden. And outside, at Fernley, the sundial cast a new shadow, one that pointed not to the past, but to the final pieces of a truth, decades in hiding. Chapter 17. What the sundial saw. Fernley House. The next morning dawn arrived in Marleycombe with an eerie stillness. Not the peace of rest, but the hush that comes before something finally gives way. Miss Marple arrived at Fernley just as the dew was lifting. Gilly met her at the door, already dressed in walking boots and holding a small linen pouch. You asked for soil samples from near the sundial, she said. Why there? Miss Marple's eyes drifted across the garden, her voice quiet. Because the sundial always points to where time stopped. And I believe someone tried to bury more than just secrets beneath it. They worked in silence, digging, carefully along the sundial's base, just beside the northeast edge where the grass never quite grew. Right. 3 inches down, Gilly struck something. Not stone dot wood dot. They cleared the earth, carefully until the top of a small weathered box emerged. A chest no larger than a cake tin, bound in leather and sealed with a rusted latch. Gilly hesitated. Do we open it? Miss Marple nodded once. Inside, a folded handkerchief, 2 photographs, and a glass vial empty, but still bearing a label. In faint copperplate, belladonna extract minus 0.5 milliliters. For veterinary use only. Gilly recoiled slightly. Poison. Miss Marple said nothing, just turned over the handkerchief. Embroidered on the corner was a single letter. B. Beatrice, she murmured. Margaret's younger sister. Later that morning, Inspector Renner arrived at Fernley and examined the contents. Where did this come from again? He asked. Miss Marple handed him the photographs. One was of Walter Renshaw, standing beside Beatrice in the same Fernley garden. The second was more disturbing. Beatrice, alone, seated at a table with a bottle of port and 2 glasses, one full, one not. Beatrice and Walter were lovers. Miss Marple said, not just friends. Margaret knew. But so did Hargreaves. And it wasn't Margaret who brought poison into this garden. It was Beatrice. Renner frowned. But she left the village. She disappeared, Miss Marple corrected him. The official story was that she moved to the continent. But I think Margaret sent her away. Gilly brought out a thin envelope from the Fernley archives. Found this behind a false panel in Margaret's wardrobe. It was a letter unsigned, undated, but unmistakably in Beatrice's handwriting. You said you forgave me, but I see your face every time I close my eyes. I loved him. You loved him. But only one of us was ever brave enough to say it. I did. It because I couldn't stand watching him love someone else. Gilly read it aloud, her voice trembling. She poisoned him, she whispered. Miss Marple nodded. Margaret covered for her sister. Let Walter take the fall. Let Pike believe it was an accident. Even let Hargreaves live, thinking perhaps he had done it. Renner sat back, stunned. And the entire village has lived under a shadow for decades. For a crime committed out of unspoken love. No, said Miss Marple. Out of jealousy. By afternoon, the press had caught wind. Rumors circled, most exaggerated, some cruel. Miss Marple ignored them all. She sat in the garden with Gilly and Vivian. For once, neither woman spoke. There was nothing left to argue about. The truth had come, and it had not been kind. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and poured a small glass of elderflower cordial. She raised it to the empty room. To Walter, she said softly. To Margaret. To the garden, which forgets nothing. Then she placed the vial, the photos, and the letter into her LOCKBOX. Not for the world to see. But for history to remember when it was ready. Chapter 18. A shadow in the window. Fernley House. 3 days later the house had quieted, but the echoes remained. Gilly. Heart moved through Fernley, like a woman learning to breathe in a new home won. Inherited not just by blood, but by burden. The garden no longer frightened her, nor did the house's long silences. But there were still shadows that shifted when no one moved, and windows that reflected more than glass. That afternoon, as the sky turned pale with the hint of summer, Gilly stood in the music room with Inspector Renner, Miss Marple, and Vivian Pike. On the piano was the final piece. A letter postmarked 3 decades ago. Never delivered. It had arrived in the village post just that morning, forwarded from an old address in Paris. To M.E. I've done what you asked. I'm never coming back to Fernley. Not because I'm afraid, because I'm tired of pretending. You may keep the house, keep your secrets. But if anyone ever asks why I left, you tell them I couldn't forgive myself. Not for him, not for you, and not for what I became. If you ever find the bottle, bury it deep. Some poisons don't leave the body. Some stay in the soul. She did confess, Renner said, setting the letter down. She admitted it. Margaret wasn't protecting her reputation. She was protecting her sister's guilt. And perhaps, Miss Marple added, trying to protect Edward from the truth of his father's death. Vivian stared out the window. Toward the sundial, the earth around it freshly turned. There's something cruel, she said softly, in how many people suffer just to keep one name clean. Gilly said nothing, but Miss Marple's expression shifted thoughtful, almost sad. Later that evening, Gilly sat alone in the drawing room, the house hushed by twilight. The fire crackled faintly, the air scented with rosewood and something else, something old. She thought about Margaret, about the letter she had left for a daughter she never claimed, about the garden she had loved, about Beatrice, long vanished, her final words inked in regret. A sound broke the silence. Glass. A faint click, like a window latch sliding. Gilly stood, alert. Another sound. This time near the back hall. She moved quietly, hand brushing the edge of the sideboard where a small brass letter opener lay. The back door was open, and a single black feather rested just outside, caught in the dew-damp grass. Miss Marple arrived 10 minutes later. The police were called. Footprints were found, deliberate, circling the sundial and leading to the rear hedge. Nothing was taken. But the message was clear. Someone had returned. I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that Beatrice may not be dead. Gilly stared. But she left 30 years ago. She'd be, nearly 80? Some ghosts don't haunt graves, Miss Marple said. They haunt legacies. That night, Miss Marple couldn't sleep. She sat at her writing desk, fire dimming to a soft glow. She opened her notebook, drew a new page, and wrote, Beatrice is alive. The letter proves it. Someone delivered it, now not by accident, but by design. She wanted us to read it. Just before she came back. And underneath that, the garden hasn't finished speaking yet. Chapter 19. The Woman by the Gate. Marleycombe. 2 days later. The village fair arrived early that summer, as if to reassure Marleycombe that life, despite everything, would continue. Children chased ribbons down the green. Bunting waved from lampposts, and the church bell rang out with a cheerfulness that felt almost defiant. But at the edge of the crowd, Miss Marple stood quite still. She had seen something, or rather, someone. Near the wrought iron gate that led to the old railway path stood a woman, cloaked in gray, wide-brimmed hat, gloved hands, head bowed, watching. Not the villagers, not the stalls. Just Fernleigh. Miss Marple walked toward her, unhurried. The woman turned. Their eyes met. No words were spoken. Then the woman walked away swiftly, deliberately vanishing down the path, like morning mist. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple met Gilly in Fernley's drawing room. You saw her, Gilly said. It wasn't a question. Miss Marple nodded. Double quotes. Do you think it was Beatrice? I do. But why now? Miss Marple lowered herself into an armchair. Because the garden is nearly done speaking, and I believe she wants to hear the last word. Gilly paced to the window. What does she want from me? Miss Marple looked toward the sundial. Not from you, for you. That evening, Vivian Pike arrived with a sealed envelope. It had been slid under her door at the Rose Hill Inn. She laid it on the table. Miss Marple opened it. Inside, a torn page from a journal. Faint, shaky handwriting. The ink smudged by what might have been tears or rain. I stood by as he drank it. I thought it would just make him ill. I didn't know it would end him. Margaret tried to stop me, but by then it was too late. She said we'd bury it, the bottle, the story, our lives. I didn't come back to claim anything. I came to see the tree bloom again. Just once. There was no signature dot, only a pressed. Flower a sprig of nightshade. Inspector Renner, upon hearing the news, launched a quiet inquiry. No warrants, no headlines. Just a list of local lodgings and travel manifests. But Beatrice Edivane had always been clever. There were no records. No. Credit slips. No name. Just an old woman, seen once walking along the coastal path near Elmsworth, asking for the way to Marley Coombe. Miss Marple sat that night with her scrapbook open to the page marked Echo House. She took a fresh sheet and wrote slowly. Some murders are never solved in court, only in the garden. Final truths. W. Renshaw, L. Pike. B. Edivanish folded the page and placed it under the silver paperweight shaped like a rose. Then she turned to the final note. She had received unsigned. Sent days ago. You always see the things the rest of us look away from. Thank you for keeping our secrets buried as gently as flowers. She closed the notebook. No need to chase ghosts when they were already walking the garden path. The next morning, Gilly found a parcel at the Fernley gate. Inside was a small bronze plaque, engraved in elegant script, in memory of Margaret and Beatrice Edivane sisters. Gardeners, keepers of silence. May the echoes rest. And beside it, a single envelope marked, to be opened in bloom. Inside, a final message. Plant nothing else upon this ground. Let what we loved grow again. Let the silence be the legacy, not the crime. B. Gilly stood with the letter, the plaque in her hands. For the first time in weeks, she cried, not out of fear, but out of release. Chapter 20. The bloom in the silence. Fernley House. 1 week later, summer came in full at last. The roses along Fernley's stone walls bloomed with such wildness that the postman paused just to admire them. Clematis curled over the trellis like lace, and the wisteria that once framed Margaret Edivane's favorite bench hung heavy with purple blossoms, nodding gently in the breeze. The garden had begun to breathe again, but it did not forget. Gilly knelt beside the sundial, now polished clean, her fingers tracing the inscription newly carved beneath its base. To those who watched, waited, and forgave. The plaque for Margaret and Beatrice had been placed nearby, under the oldest tree and ash, whose roots had cracked the soil, and, perhaps, the truth with it. Beside her, Miss Marple stood with a small trowel and a paper packet. Foxglove, she said, holding it out. They grow quietly, but they're not silent. Gilly smiled faintly. Like some people I know, they planted them together. No speeches, no eulogies. Just the sound of earth receiving what had long been denied at peace. Vivian Pike had chosen to leave Marleycombe. She came to say goodbye that afternoon. Where will you go? Gilly asked. Vivian shrugged. Bath, maybe, or the coast. Somewhere I can write and not be watched. Miss Marple nodded. And what will you write? Vivian thought for a long moment. A story, she said finally, about a garden that remembered, and a woman who almost forgot who she was until it bloomed again. They exchanged a long look. Vivian held out her hand to Gilly. No bitterness, no rivalry, not just a shared inheritance of grief, now grown into something gentler. That night, Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead. She watered her geraniums, took out her scrapbook, and turned to the final page of the Echo House file. She wrote, Walter Renshaw, poisoned, loved, misremembered Margaret Edivane, protector, keeper, forgiver Beatrice, the ghost that returned not for redemption, but for release Leonard Pike, the witness who wrote the truth Gilly Hart, the heir who listened to Vivian Pike, the echo that found her voice, and then, in careful, Even script, she added, mystery resolved. Wounds remain, but fernley blooms. She closed the book. The case, at last, was over. Outside, the nightingales sang above the hedge's dot, and in a garden far away, beneath a sundial and a plaque, the earth held its silence, not out of secrecy, but peace.